Kyle Harper wiped the sweat from his forehead as he walked through the crowded merchant district of Valendra Station, and the air was thick with the smell of alien spices and the sound of 100 different languages mixing together like a strange song. He had been working on the station for 3 months now, loading cargo containers onto merchant ships, and the pay was decent enough to send money back to his sister on Earth, who was raising 2 kids on her own. The station was a massive wheel, spinning in space where traders from across the galaxy came to buy and sell everything from rare metals to exotic foods. And Kyle had learned to keep his head down and do his job without asking too many questions. That policy served him well until the afternoon when he heard the commotion near the East Corridor market stalls. A crowd had formed in a loose circle, and Kyle could see people looking, but nobody was stepping forward to help. And that made his stomach twist because he knew what that meant. He pushed through the crowd and saw 3 Kravax enforcers cornering a young woman against the wall between 2 market stalls. The woman was an elf, or at least, that was what the other species called her people, and she stood barely 5 feet tall with silver hair that fell to her waist and skin that seemed to glow faintly in the station lights. Her eyes were bright green like emeralds, and they were wide with fear as the 3 Kravax moved closer. The Kravax were bad news on any station, and everyone knew it because they hired themselves out as muscle and security. But really they were just thugs with scales and official badges. These 3 were typical of their kind, standing over 7 feet tall with dark red scales covering their bodies and faces that looked like a cross between a lizard and a shark. What caught Kyle's attention, though, were the 2 small dragons perched on the elf woman's shoulders. They were no bigger than house cats with scales that shimmered blue and gold in the light, and they hissed at the Kravax with tiny mouths full of sharp teeth. One of the Kravax reached for the woman, and she pressed herself back against the wall, while her dragons spread their small wings and made threatening sounds. That would have been cute if the situation was not so serious. Kyle did not think about what he did next, because thinking would have meant recognizing how stupid it was. He stepped out of the crowd and moved between the Kravax and the elf woman. 3 enforcers stopped and looked at him like he was an insect that had landed in their food. "Get lost, human." The largest one growled, and his translator chip made the words sound even more menacing in perfect English. Kyle's heart was hammering in his chest, but he kept his voice steady when he said, "I don't think she wants your company." The Kravax looked at each other and then back at Kyle, and something cruel moved behind their yellow eyes. "You want to be a hero?" the leader asked, and his clawed hand flexed at his side. Kyle had been a construction worker back on Earth before joining the merchant fleet, and he had been in his share of fights. But he knew he was way out of his league here. These creatures had natural armor plating and probably twice his strength, and there were 3 of them. But the elf woman behind him made a small sound of fear, and her dragons chirped with distress, and Kyle knew he could not walk away. "I just think you should move along," he said, and tried to sound more confident than he felt. The first punch came so fast he barely saw it. The Kravax's fist caught him in the ribs, and he heard something crack, and the pain was like fire spreading through his chest. He stumbled but stayed on his feet, and the second blow caught him across the face and split his lip open. Blood filled his mouth with the taste of copper, and his vision went blurry for a second. Behind him, the elf woman cried out, and her dragons made sounds like angry bells. Kyle raised his arms to protect his head, but the Kravax were not playing anymore, and the third one grabbed his shirt and lifted him off his feet. "You should have walked away, human." The creature hissed and drew back his fist for what Kyle knew would be a killing blow. The elf woman screamed something in a language Kyle did not understand, and suddenly, there were more voices shouting. Station security came running through the crowd with weapons drawn, and the 3 Kravax dropped Kyle and scattered into the marketplace like roaches when the lights come on. Kyle hit the floor hard and gasped for air while pain radiated from his ribs and his face felt like it was on fire. Small hands touched his shoulders, and he looked up to see the elf woman kneeling beside him with tears streaming down her face. Her dragons landed on the floor next to him, and one of them gently licked the blood from his knuckles with a tongue that felt like warm silk. "Why did you do that?" the woman whispered, and her voice carried a musical accent that made even those simple words sound beautiful. Kyle tried to smile, but his split lip made it hurt too much, so he just said, "Because nobody should have to face that alone." The woman helped him sit up while station security asked questions and took statements, and one officer looked at Kyle like he was the biggest fool in the galaxy. "You're lucky they didn't kill you," the officer said, and Kyle figured that was probably true. The elf woman refused to leave his side, and her dragons perched on her shoulders again, watching everything with bright, intelligent eyes that seemed far too smart for creatures so small. When the security officers finally left, she helped Kyle to his feet and said, "Come with me, and I will get you to the medical bay." Kyle wanted to say he was fine, but when he tried to stand straight, the pain in his ribs made him gasp, so he let her guide him through the corridors. People stared as they passed because a human leaning on an elf woman with two small dragons was not something you saw every day. The medical bay was run by a Trollian doctor who had too many arms and not enough patience. He looked at Kyle's injuries and muttered about foolish humans with death wishes, while his multiple hands worked on sealing the cut on Kyle's lip and wrapping his cracked ribs. The elf woman waited the entire time, sitting in a chair with her dragons, now calm and grooming their scales. When the doctor finally finished and cleared Kyle to leave, she stood and said, "My name is Lyra Silverwind, and I am from the forest moon of Ethelmere." "Kyle Harper," he said, and shook her small hand, which was surprisingly strong. Lyra looked at him with those green eyes and said, "My brothers will want to meet you." Kyle was not sure what that meant, but something in her expression told him his life was about to get a lot more complicated. Kyle spent the next 2 days trying to forget about the incident with the Kravax and focus on his work, but his cracked ribs made lifting cargo containers a special kind of torture, and every time he looked in the mirror, the bruises on his face reminded him of how close he had come to something much worse. He kept thinking about Lyra and her strange comment about her brothers wanting to meet him, and he wondered if that was just a polite thing to say, or if she actually meant it. On the 3rd day after the fight, Kyle was walking back to his quarters after a long shift, when he noticed 5 figures standing in the corridor outside his door. In row were elves like Lyra, but these were warriors, and there was no mistaking it. They wore armor that looked like it had been grown rather than forged, with plates that curved and flowed like tree bark, but gleamed like metal in the corridor lights. Each one carried weapons that hummed with a faint energy Kyle could feel in his teeth, and their eyes glowed with an inner light that made his skin prickle. The tallest one stepped forward, and Kyle noticed he had the same silver hair as Lyra, but his was tied back in a warrior's braid, and his face was harder with scars across one cheek. "You are Kyle Harper," the elf said, and it was not a question. Kyle nodded and tried not to show how nervous he was, because these warriors looked like they could tear him apart without breaking a sweat. "I am Aldrich Silverwind," the tall elf continued, "and these are my brothers Torin, Brennan, Felix, and Garrett, and we have come to speak with you about our sister." Kyle's mouth went dry, and he said, "If this is about the fight, I didn't mean to cause any trouble for her." Aldrich's expression did not change as he said, "You took a beating for our sister when you had no reason to, when you had everything to lose and nothing to gain." The other warriors moved closer, and Kyle found himself surrounded by 5 of the deadliest-looking beings he had ever seen. On Earth, such an act would be called foolish. Aldrich continued, "But among our people, it is called honor." He reached out and gripped Kyle's shoulder hard enough to bruise and looked him straight in the eyes. "You stood when others walked away, and you bled when you could have been safe. And for that you have earned something precious." Kyle did not know what to say, so he just stood there while Aldrich's grip on his shoulder tightened even more. "You are family now," the elf warrior said, and his voice carried a weight that made the words feel like a binding oath. Kyle blinked, because that was not what he had expected at all. "Family," he repeated, because his brain was having trouble keeping up. Aldrich smiled, and it transformed his face from scary to merely dangerous. "Among my people, family is not just blood. It is choice and action and loyalty, and you chose to stand for our sister when no one else would." Other warriors nodded, and one of them, named Torin, said, "Family does not stand alone, and now neither will you." Kyle felt something hot and uncomfortable in his chest, and he realized it was emotion trying to work its way up his throat. "I just did what anyone should do," he managed to say, "but you are the only one who did," Aldrich replied, "and that makes all the difference." He released Kyle's shoulder and gestured down the corridor. "Come and we will share a meal, and you will learn what it means to be claimed by the Silverwind clan." Kyle followed them, because he did not know what else to do, and also because turning down an invitation from 5 armed warriors seemed like a bad idea. They led him through parts of the station he had never seen before, where the walls were covered in living vines, and the air smelled like forests, and the lights were softer and more natural. The elf quarter, Kyle realized, and he had heard about, but never actually visited. They brought him to a large common room where other elves were gathered, and the ceiling was hung with plants that glowed faintly in the dimness. Lyra was there with her 2 dragons, and when she saw Kyle, her face lit up with a smile that made his heart do something strange in his chest. "You came," she said, and moved toward him with her dragons chirping happily on her shoulders. "Did I have a choice?" Kyle asked. But he was smiling despite the pain in his ribs. Aldrich laughed and said, "You always have a choice, brother, but you keep making the right ones." They sat him down at a long table carved from what looked like a single piece of wood, and brought him food that tasted like nothing he had ever eaten before. There were fruits that sparkled like gems, and bread that tasted of honey, and meat that had been seasoned with herbs that made his tongue tingle in a pleasant way. The dragons left Lyra's shoulders and explored the table with curious chirps, and when they got close to Kyle, one of them climbed onto his arm and settled there like it belonged. Lyra laughed and said, "They like you. And that is rare, because dragons are very particular about who they trust." Kyle looked down at the small creature on his arm, with its blue and gold scales catching the light, and felt something warm spread through his chest. "What are their names?" he asked. "Star and Ember," Lyra said, and pointed to each one in turn. "And they have been my companions since they hatched 5 years." Aga the warriors began telling stories, and Kyle learned that the Silverwind clan were protectors of their homeworld, and they traveled the galaxy as traders but also as defenders of those who could not defend themselves. Aldrich told a story about fighting space pirates near the Andromeda sector, and Torin described hunting a creature on a jungle world that had been terrorizing a village. Each story was more incredible than the last, and Kyle realized these were not just warriors, but legends in their own right. And yet they were treating him like an equal, like someone who belonged at their table. "You should come to Ethelmere," Aldrich said suddenly, "and see our homeworld, and meet the rest of the clan." Kyle nearly choked on his drink and said, "I appreciate the offer, but I have a job here and responsibilities." Aldrich waved his hand dismissively and said, "Jobs can be found anywhere, but family is forever." The other warriors agreed, and Lyra leaned forward with those green eyes shining. "Please, come," she said, "and I want to show you the forests where I grew up and the mountains where the great dragons nest." Kyle looked around the table at these beings who had claimed him as one of their own, for nothing more than doing what his conscience had demanded. He thought about his small quarters on the station and his job loading cargo, and the sister back on Earth who told him to find something worth living for. Maybe this was it. "How long would I need to stay?" he asked. And Aldrich's smile was fierce and bright. "As long as you want, brother, because family does not count days." Kyle felt the dragon on his arm purr like a tiny engine, and Lyra squeezed his hand across the table. He thought about saying no, about explaining that he was just a human from Earth with nothing special about him, but then he looked at their faces and saw acceptance and respect and something that might have been hope. "Okay," he said, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears. "Okay, I'll come." The warriors cheered, and Lyra's smile was worth every bruise on Kyle's face, and the dragons took flight in celebration loops around the room. Kyle Harper had taken a beating for a stranger, and somehow that single act of courage had earned him something he never expected. Family that would stand beside him no matter what came next. Kyle quit his job the next morning, and his supervisor looked at him like he had lost his mind when he explained he was leaving with a family of elf warriors to visit their homeworld. "You've been here 3 months, the supervisor said, "and now you're throwing away steady work for what exactly? For something that matters." Kyle replied, and he was surprised by how true those words felt. He packed his single bag of belongings, which did not take long because he had never been one to collect things, and by afternoon he was standing at the docking bay watching the Silverwind ship prepare for departure. The vessel was unlike anything Kyle had seen before, with curves and flowing lines that made it look more like a living thing than a machine, and the hull seemed to shift colors in the light from silver to green. To blue. Lyra stood beside him with Star and Ember perched on her shoulders, and she explained that elf ships were grown from special trees on their homeworld and bonded with crystal technology that humans were only beginning to understand. "It's beautiful," Kyle said, and meant it. Lyra smiled and said, Wait until you see Ethelmere, because the ships are nothing compared to the forest's Aldrich. And his brothers finished the pre-flight checks and called for everyone to board. Kyle walked up the ramp with his bag over his shoulder and stepped into a world that smelled of cedar and starlight. The interior of the ship had walls that looked like polished wood but were warm to the touch, and the floor had a slight give, like walking on moss. There were no harsh angles or cold metal surfaces, and the lighting came from crystals embedded in the ceiling that glowed with soft natural light. "Your quarters are this way," Torrin said, and led Kyle down a corridor to a small cabin. It was simple but comfortable, with a bed that looked more like a nest made of soft materials, and a window that showed the vast expanse of space. Beyond, Kyle set down his bag and realized his hands were shaking slightly, because the reality of what he had agreed to was starting to sink in. He was leaving everything familiar behind to travel with people he barely knew to a world he had only heard about in stories. Lyra appeared in the doorway with her dragons and said, "Are you afraid?" Kyle thought about lying, but something in her eyes made him tell the truth. "A little," he admitted. She stepped into the room and sat on the edge of the bed, while her dragons hopped down to explore the small space. "That is wise," she said, "because big changes should be a little frightening, or they are not big enough to matter." Kyle sat beside her and asked, "What if I don't fit in? And what if your family decides I'm not worth the trouble?" Lyra looked at him with those green eyes that seemed to see right through him. "You took a beating for me when you did not have to, and that kind of courage cannot be faked, and my brothers do not make their oaths lightly, and when Aldrich called you family, he meant it with everything he is." Star crawled onto Kyle's lap and curled up like a cat, and the warmth of the small dragon was oddly comforting. The ship began to move, and Kyle felt a slight vibration through the floor as they pulled away from the station. Through the window, he watched Valendra Station grow smaller until it was just another point of light among millions. There was no turning back now. The journey to Ethelmere would take 3 weeks through hyperspace, and Kyle spent those weeks learning what it meant to be part of an elf warrior clan. Every morning, Aldrich woke him before dawn for training, and Kyle learned that the warriors did not just fight with weapons, but with their whole bodies, in a style that looked like dancing but hit like hammers. His ribs were still healing, so Aldrich went easy on him, but even easy training with an elf warrior left Kyle exhausted and covered in sweat. "You move like a human," Aldrich said one morning, and it was not a compliment. Kyle wiped sweat from his face and said, "That's probably because I am." One Aldrich smiled and said, "Yes, but you can learn to move like water and strike like lightning, if you are willing to put in the work." Kyle was willing because he had nothing else to do, and also because he was starting to understand that these warriors had given him a gift by accepting him, and he wanted to be worthy of it. Torrin taught him their language in the afternoons, and Kyle discovered he had a decent ear for it, even though the words felt strange in his mouth. The elf language was full of flowing sounds and musical tones, and Torrin said it was derived from the songs of the great dragons who had taught the first elves how to speak. Lyra spent her evenings with Kyle, teaching him about elf culture and history. She told him about the forest moon of Ethelmere, where trees grew as tall as mountains, and the canopy was so thick that some elves lived their entire lives without touching the ground. She described the great dragons who nested in the highest branches and were revered as ancient guardians of the forest. And she explained the concept of family among her people, which was not about blood, but about choice and loyalty, and the willingness to stand together against anything. Star and Ember became Kyle's constant companions, and they seemed to know when he was frustrated or homesick because they would curl up on his shoulders and purr until he felt better. One evening, Kyle asked Lyra why the dragons liked him so much. She looked surprised by the question and said, "Dragons can sense the truth in people, and they see what you are inside, which is brave and kind and loyal." Kyle did not know what to say to that, so he just scratched Ember under the chin, and the little dragon made happy chirping sounds. Brennan taught him how to maintain weapons, and Felix showed him the basics of navigation using the ship's crystal systems. Garrett, who was the quietest of the brothers, spent time with Kyle, teaching him to meditate and find calm in the chaos. The warriors told stories every night, gathered in the common room with drinks made from fermented fruits that tasted like sunshine. They spoke of battles fought and worlds saved and friends lost, and Kyle began to understand that these warriors carried heavy burdens beneath their confident exteriors. One night Aldrich told the story of how he had failed to save a village from raiders years ago, and the guilt in his voice was raw and real. "We cannot save everyone," he said. "And that is the hardest lesson for any warrior to learn." Kyle thought about the day he had stepped between Lyra and the Kravaks and how easily it could have ended differently. "Why do you do it?" he asked, "and why risk everything for strangers?" Aldrich looked at him with those glowing green eyes and said, "Because if we do not stand for those who cannot stand for themselves, then what is the point of having strength?" The other warriors agreed, and Kyle felt something shift inside him, because he realized these were not just warriors but heroes in the truest sense, and they had called him family. On the 18th day of the journey, Kyle woke to find Lyra sitting by his window watching the stars. He sat beside her and asked if everything was okay. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "I have been thinking about the day you saved me, and how different my life would be if you had walked away." Kyle did not know what to say to that. "Most people did walk away," she continued, "and I do not blame them because the Kravaks are dangerous and interfering could have meant death. But you did not walk away." Kyle shrugged and said, "I couldn't, and I don't know why, but I just couldn't." Lyra turned to look at him, and there were tears in her eyes. "That is exactly why my brothers call you family," she said. "Because you have the rarest kind of courage, which is the courage to do what is right, even when it costs you everything." She took his hand and squeezed it, and Star and Ember pressed against his neck, making soft, comforting sounds. Kyle felt emotion rising in his throat, and he realized that for the first time since leaving Earth, he did not feel lost. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The ship dropped out of hyperspace on the 21st day, and Kyle stood at the observation deck window staring at the sight before him. Ethelmere hung in space like a green jewel, and even from orbit, he could see the massive forest that covered the moon's surface. Great dragons wheeled through the atmosphere, leaving trails of colored light, and the cities gleamed like crystals growing from the treetops. "Welcome home," Brother Aldrich said, and put a hand on Kyle's shoulder. Kyle looked at the warrior who had given him a place to belong and said, "Thank you." Aldrich smiled fierce and bright and said, "No, Kyle Harper. Thank you for reminding us what it means to be truly human, which is the best thing anyone can be." The ship descended through layers of atmosphere that shimmered with colors Kyle had no names for, and as they broke through the clouds, he got his first real look at Ethelmere. The forests stretched as far as he could see, with trees that rose thousands of feet into the sky, their trunks as wide as city blocks and their branches forming a canopy that looked like a green ocean. Crystal cities grew from the treetops, connected by bridges made of living vines, and everywhere Kyle looked, he saw dragons soaring through the air with wingspans that could have covered a football field. "It's impossible," he whispered, because his brain could not quite process what he was seeing. Lyra laughed beside him, with Star and Ember chirping excitedly on her shoulders, and said, "Wait until you walk among the roots where the old forest keeps its secrets." The ship landed on a platform that was woven into the branches of a tree, so massive Kyle could not see where the trunk ended and the sky began. When the ramp lowered, he stepped out and the air hit him like a physical force. It smelled of growing things and ancient wood and something else he could not identify, but that made his chest feel light and his head clear. "Welcome to the Silverwind clan, home," Aldrich said with pride in his voice. The platform was alive with activity as elves moved about their business, and more dragons than Kyle could count perched on every available surface. Some dragons were small, like Star and Ember, while others were large enough to swallow a person whole, and a few in the distance looked big enough to carry houses. An elder elf approached with silver hair that fell past her waist and eyes that glowed with wisdom earned over centuries. She looked at Kyle, and then at Aldrich, and said, "So this is the human who earned the warrior's mark without even trying." Aldrich bowed his head respectfully and said, "Grandmother, this is Kyle Harper, and he stood for Lyra when no one else would." The elder studied Kyle with eyes that seemed to see into his soul, and then she smiled. "You have the look of someone who surprises himself," she said, "and that is a good quality because it means you are still growing." She placed her hand on Kyle's forehead and spoke words in the old language that Torin had not taught him yet. When she removed her hand, Kyle felt different somehow, like something inside him had been awakened. "You are blessed by the forest now," she said, "and the dragons will know you as friend, and the trees will shelter you, and you are Silverwind." Kyle did not know what that meant, but from the expressions on the faces around him, it was important. Lyra took his hand and said, "Come and I will show you where you will stay." She led him across bridges made of vines that swayed gently under his feet, and Kyle tried not to look down at the impossible distance to the forest floor below. They passed homes built into the trees themselves, with walls of living wood and windows that were simply gaps in the trunk covered by curtains of leaves. Children ran past chasing small dragons, and their laughter sounded like bells. Elder elves sat in gardens suspended in the air tending plants that glowed with soft light. Warriors practiced combat on platforms with weapons humming, and the sound of their movements was like wind through branches. "This is the guest house," Lyra said, and stopped at a dwelling that looked grown rather than built. Kyle stepped inside and found a space that was larger than it looked from outside, with furniture made from shaped wood and cushions stuffed with something soft that smelled like flowers. A window looked out over the canopy, and Kyle could see for miles in every direction. Star and Ember flew around the room, chirping their approval before settling on a perch near the window. "You like it?" Lyra asked. Kyle turned to her and said, "I don't have words for what this is." She smiled and said, "Rest. And tonight, there will be a feast to welcome you properly to the clan." After she left, Kyle sat on the bed and tried to process everything that had happened in the past 3 weeks. He had gone from loading cargo on a space station to being adopted by warrior elves and blessed by a forest grandmother on an impossible moon. His sister back on Earth would never believe any of this. That evening, the entire clan gathered in a great hall that was carved into the trunk of the eldest tree. Long tables were laden with food that looked like art and smelled like heaven. There were fruits that changed color when you bit into them, and vegetables that tasted different depending on how you chewed them, and meat from animals Kyle did not recognize, but that melted on his tongue. The warriors sat Kyle at the head table next to Aldrich, and the grandmother speeches were made in the elf language, and Torin quietly translated for Kyle. They spoke of honor and courage and the ancient law that said anyone who stood for the helpless was worthy of the highest respect. When it was Aldrich's turn to speak, he stood and looked directly at Kyle. 3 weeks ago, he said, "My sister was in danger, and this human who owed us nothing risked everything, and he took a beating that should have killed him, and he never asked for reward or recognition." He paused, and the hall was silent. That is the mark of true character. And among our people, such actions cannot go unrecognized, and so I declare before the clan that Kyle Harper is my brother, in all ways that matter. The hall erupted in cheers, and Kyle felt his face burning, with embarrassment and pride in equal measure. Lyra stood next and said, "Kyle showed me that courage is not about being strong or skilled, but about choosing to act when action is hard." She raised her cup and said to Kyle Harper, who reminds us what it means to be honorable. Everyone drank, and Kyle stood on shaky legs because he felt like he should say something. "I'm just a guy from Earth," he started, and his voice cracked slightly. "I didn't do anything special, and I just did what felt right." Aldrich laughed and said, "That is exactly what makes it special." Brother Kyle continued, "I never had much family back home, and my parents died when I was young, and my sister and I made our own way, and I learned that family is not about blood, but about who stands with you when things get hard." He looked around the hall at all the faces watching him. "You all have given me something I never expected to find, and a place to belong, and people who see me as more than just another worker or another human." His voice grew stronger as he spoke. "I don't know what I did to deserve this, but I promise I will spend every day trying to be worthy of the faith you have shown me." The hall was silent for a moment, and then the grandmother stood. "You already are worthy," she said, "and that is why we chose you." The feast went late into the night with music and dancing and stories. Kyle learned that elf celebrations were loud and joyful, with everyone participating, regardless of age or rank. Dragons flew overhead, breathing harmless colored fire that lit up the hall like fireworks. Children climbed on Kyle asking questions about Earth and humans, and whether it was true that his people had tamed Lightning Lyra stayed. Close translating when Kyle got lost and laughing at his attempts to dance in the elf style. You move like a tree in a hurricane, she teased, but it is charming. Star and Ember performed aerial tricks for the crowd and earned treats from dozens of willing hands. As the night wound down, Kyle found himself outside on a balcony. Looking up at stars he did not recognize, Aldrich joined him with 2 cups of the fermented fruit. "Drink. You did well tonight," the warrior said. Kyle accepted the cup and said, "I still don't understand why you all are doing this for me." Aldrich was quiet for a moment, watching a dragon soar past trailing silver light. "My people have existed for thousands of years," he finally said, "and in all that time we have learned one truth, above all others." He turned to look at Kyle. Character matters more than strength and compassion. Matters more than skill, and a person who will stand for what is right even when they are afraid is worth more than 100 skilled cowards. Kyle drank from his cup and let the words sink in. "We saw your character that day on the station." Aldrich continued, "And we saw someone worth knowing, worth protecting, worth calling family." He put his hand on Kyle's shoulder. "And we do not make that choice lightly." Kyle felt emotion rising in his throat again, and he said, "Thank you. Does not seem like enough." Aldrich smiled and said, "Then show us through your actions as you have already begun to do." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the dragons dance through the night sky. Kyle thought about the beating he had taken and how it had led to this moment, standing on an alien moon surrounded by people who called him family. Sometimes the hardest choices led to the best outcomes. Sometimes standing up when it was easier to walk away changed everything. And sometimes courage was not about being fearless, but about being afraid and doing the right thing anyway. As if reading his thoughts, Aldrich raised his cup and said to courage in all its forms. Kyle raised his own cup and said to family in all its forms. They drank under the stars of a world that was now home. Kyle woke the next morning to find Star and Ember perched on his chest, staring at him with bright eyes. And when he tried to move, they chirped in protest until he gave them the attention they clearly felt they deserved. Outside his window, the forest was alive with sound, as dragons called to each other and elves went about their morning routines. Someone knocked on his door, and Kyle found Lyra waiting with a basket of what looked like breakfast. "I thought you might be hungry," she said, and her smile was warm in the morning light. They ate together on the small balcony outside his room, and Kyle learned that the fruit in the basket changed flavor based on the time of day, and right now it tasted like sunshine and honey. "What happens now?" he asked, because he was not sure what his role was supposed to be here. Lyra tilted her head thoughtfully and said, "That depends on what you want, and you are family now, which means you have the freedom to choose your own path." Kyle had spent most of his adult life just surviving, working whatever jobs he could find to send money home. And the idea of choosing his own path felt strange and wonderful. Before he could answer, Aldrich appeared at the door with his brother's time for training, the warrior said, and his smile suggested Kyle was not going to enjoy what came next. The training grounds were suspended platforms high in the canopy where the wind was strong, and the view was dizzying. Aldrich handed Kyle a wooden practice sword and said, "Today you learn what it truly means to fight." For the next 3 hours, Kyle discovered that everything he thought he knew about combat was wrong. The elves fought with a fluid grace that made it look like they were dancing even as they struck with devastating precision. Aldrich moved like water flowing around Kyle's clumsy attacks and tapping him lightly with the practice sword wherever his guard was weak. "You think too much," the warrior said, "and fighting is not about thinking but about becoming one with the moment." Kyle tried to empty his mind like Garrett had taught him in meditation, but it was hard when Torin was coming at him from the left and Brennan from the right. He got knocked down more times than he could count, and his body was covered in bruises that would hurt later. But slowly, something began to click. He stopped trying to predict what would happen and started simply reacting. His movements became smoother and less forced. When Felix came at him with a high strike, Kyle found himself ducking and countering without conscious thought. "Good," Aldrich called out. "And now you are beginning to understand." After training, they took him to the healing pools where natural hot springs bubbled up through the roots of the great trees. The water was infused with minerals that made Kyle's bruises fade and his muscles relax. He floated on his back, looking up through the canopy at the sky, and thought, about how strange and wonderful his life had become. Over the following weeks, Kyle settled into a rhythm that felt more natural than anything he had known on Earth. Mornings were for training with the warriors. Afternoons were for learning with Lyra, who taught him about dragon care and forest lore and the history of her people. Evenings were for gathering with the clan, sharing meals and stories and laughter. The dragon Star and Ember became his constant shadows, following him everywhere, and sleeping curled up on his chest at night. He learned that dragons bonded with people they trusted, and their presence was considered a great honor. One afternoon, Lyra took him deep into the forest to meet the great dragons. They climbed down through the canopy using vines and carved steps until they reached the forest floor, where the light was green and filtered, and the air was cool and heavy with moisture. Massive roots twisted through the ground like ancient highways, and between them grew flowers that glowed in the shadows. "This is the old forest," Lyra said softly, "and few outsiders ever see this place." They walked for what felt like hours until they came to a clearing, where a dragon, the size of a building, lay coiled around a tree trunk. Its scales were deep green and gold, and its eyes, when they opened, were older than mountains. Lyra bowed deeply and spoke in the ancient language. The dragon's gaze shifted to Kyle, and he felt like every secret he had ever kept was being laid bare. He did not know what to do, so he bowed as Lyra had done. The dragon made a sound like distant thunder, and Lyra's eyes went wide. "What did it say?" Kyle asked. "It said, 'You have the mark of the forest and the courage of the small, and you are welcome here.'" The dragon lowered its massive head, and Kyle reached out with a trembling hand to touch the scales. They were warm and smooth, and he felt a connection flow through him like electricity. Star and Ember flew from his shoulders to land on the great dragon's snout, and they chirped happily as if greeting an old friend. The dragon rumbled again, and Lyra translated, "It says you are blessed by the little ones, and that means you carry the protection of all dragons." Kyle felt tears in his eyes, and he did not know why, except that this moment felt important in a way he could not explain. On the way back through the forest, Lyra was quiet, until finally she said, "You have been given a rare gift today." Kyle looked at her and asked, "What do you mean?" She stopped walking and turned to face him with Star and Ember perched on her shoulders. "The great dragons do not acknowledge outsiders easily," she said. "And what happened today has happened only a handful of times in our history." Kyle did not know what to say to that. Lyra continued, "You came here as my brother's guest, but now you are something more, and you are recognized by the forest itself and by the ancient guardians." "What does that mean?" Kyle asked. "It means," Lyra said with a smile, "that you are truly one of us now, in ways that go beyond words or ceremony." That evening there was a celebration smaller than the feast, but no less important. The grandmother blessed Kyle again, this time with water from the sacred springs and words that made the air shimmer. He was given a new name in the old language that Torin translated as Standing Stone because he had stood firm when others would have fallen. Aldrich presented him with a real sword forged from the metal of fallen stars and bound with living wood from the eldest tree. "This is yours, brother," the warrior said, "and may you carry it with honor." Kyle accepted the sword and felt its perfect balance and the way it seemed to sing in his hands. He looked around at the faces of his new family and said, "I left Earth, looking for work and money and a way to help my sister, but I found something better." He met Aldrich's eyes and then Lyra's, and said, "I found people who see me not for what I lack, but for what I choose to be. And I found a place where courage matters more than strength, and where family is built on loyalty and respect." His voice grew stronger as he continued, "I took a beating for someone I did not know, and somehow that single act changed my entire life." Lyra stepped forward with tears in her eyes and said, "You changed our lives too, Kyle Harper, because you reminded us that heroism is not about being the strongest or the fastest, but about standing up when it matters most." Aldrich raised his cup and said to Standing Stone, "Who shows us the best of what humans can be." The clan cheered, and Kyle felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the fermented fruit drink. Later that night he stood on his balcony, watching the dragons fly through the darkness, trailing colored light like falling stars. Star and Ember were curled up asleep inside, and the forest hummed with life all around him. Kyle thought about the day he had stepped between Lyra and the Kravax enforcers, and how terrified he had been. He thought about the pain of the beating and the crack of his ribs breaking, and he thought about everything that had come after. If someone had told him that single moment of courage would lead him here to this impossible move, and with this incredible family, he never would have believed them, but here he was, living a life he could never have imagined. Sometimes, the right choice was also the hardest. Sometimes standing up meant getting knocked down, but sometimes, getting knocked down was just the first step toward standing. Taller than you ever thought possible, Kyle smiled at the night sky and whispered a promise. To himself and to the family that had, claimed him. He would spend every day being worthy of their faith. He would stand for those who could not. Stand for themselves. He would be the kind of person who made courage look easy even when his knees were shaking, because that was what it meant to be human at their best, and that was what it meant to be Silverwind. The dragons danced through the darkness, and Kyle Harper, formerly of Earth, now of Ethelmere, watched them and knew he was finally home.